The first thing Frank remembered was the light, thin, washed out and cold, as if the sun itself didn't want to touch that place. It slipped through cracked windows and bent metal frames, landing in strange, rigid lines across the empty classroom. And right in the middle of one of those pale beams sat a child, absolutely still, like a figure preserved inside a block of frozen time. Frank Carrick had been in child protection for more than a decade. Before that, he'd lived the sort of life that made sense on paper: a steady home, a wife he adored, a daughter who used to draw him pictures on the back of grocery receipts. Back then, he believed the world moved according to simple, solid rules. But his job had carved that belief down to something thinner and more cautious. He had witnessed what people could do to the ones they were supposed to protect. Even so, there were patterns in the pain, signs that told him what was fixable and what wasn't. His instincts had become his compass, sharper than anything he'd learned in training. Bridgewater School had been left to collapse on its own bones for 6 long years. With the students transferred elsewhere, the building became nothing more than a forgotten husk, bricks peeling, windows broken, hallways claimed by mold and silence. Frank had only come because Denise, a truancy officer, mentioned teens sneaking inside to drink or smoke. Someone at the office shrugged and said, "Check it out, just in case." So he went. October air crept through the walls, cold enough that every breath Frank took turned white. The odor inside was exactly what he feared: damp paper, rust, and something deeper, an undertone of decay, the kind you couldn't quite name but felt in the back of your throat. He was ready to call it in, label it another empty lead, and head back to the car. Then he felt it. Not a noise, not the scurrying of rats, not the whistling wind. It was a pocket of pure stillness, a deliberate, unnatural quiet in one small section of the building, as if something were holding its breath. Frank didn't question it. He had learned long ago that when the world shifts like that, you listen. The stillness led him to the second floor, down a corridor where someone had sprayed thick red letters on the wall: "The future is canceled." The paint had dripped long ago, leaving the words looking like they were bleeding. The art room waited at the very end. That's where he saw the boy. At first glance, he seemed 7, maybe 8, but the more Frank looked, the less certain he became. It was like trying to judge the age of a shadow. One moment the child looked small, delicate. The next, he seemed older, as if his features didn't quite stay in place unless you stared directly at him. He sat on one of those old wooden stools that could rise or lower with a metal handle. In front of him lay a single sheet of paper, crisp, clean, too new for a school abandoned this long. Everything else in the room had been looted years before, but somehow this boy had paper, and he was drawing. Quietly, intently, as if the world outside the tip of his pencil didn't exist. Frank stepped forward, his boots crunching over flakes of plaster. The boy didn't react. Not a flinch, not a glance. Frank's breath caught in his throat, not from fear, but from something older, something instinctual. He wasn't alone in that room. He knew it, the same way he knew when a child was in danger before he saw a single bruise. He cleared his throat gently. The boy kept drawing. The light from the window seemed pinned to him, refusing to move, as if the sun itself wanted to keep him in place. And in that moment, though Frank didn't understand why, he knew this was the moment everything in his life had been quietly tilting toward. The moment when the rules he trusted would crumble, and something far stranger would begin. The cardboard beneath the boy's hand wasn't even real drawing paper. Frank recognized it immediately, the inside of a cereal box, carefully peeled open and laid flat so that only the clean side faced up. A pencil stub, barely longer than a thumb, scratched across its surface with steady, determined strokes. At first, Frank couldn't put his finger on what felt off about the child. He looked neglected. Yes, thin arms, dirt smudged across his cheeks, hair knotted from days without brushing. His jeans were ripped at the knees, his hoodie faded into a tired, ghostly gray, and his sneakers were peeling apart at the sole. But the kind of grime on him, it didn't match the kind of boy who'd been lost for months. This was recent filth, the quick accumulation from sleeping in abandoned corners for a few nights, not the deep, stubborn dirt of a child forgotten by the world for half a year. The second thing that struck Frank was far more unsettling. The boy hadn't reacted at all. Most kids, even the ones wrapped in fear, even the ones who'd stopped trusting adults, showed something when he walked into their space. A flicker of fear, a flicker of anger, a flicker of hope. Some tiny spark that said, "I know you're here." This boy remained carved out of silence. "Hey, buddy," Frank murmured, letting his voice slip into that soft, steady tone he once used to ease his own son out of nightmares. "My name's Frank. I work with the county. Just want to make sure you're safe." Nothing changed. Not his posture, not his breathing, not even the speed of his drawing. Frank took one step, then another. The old floor groaned under his boots, loud enough to startle any living creature within earshot. Still nothing. "Can you tell me your name?" he tried again. Only the faint rasp of graphite on cardboard answered him. Outside, a crow called into the wind a harsh, lonely cry that made the empty school feel even more hollow. Frank edged around the table, slow and deliberate, like approaching a wounded animal. The closer he moved, the heavier the air felt. And when he finally saw the boy's face fully, something inside him tightened. The eyes. They were open, yes, but unfocused, not staring at the room, not staring at the paper, staring through everything, as if whatever part of him understood the world had stepped somewhere far away and forgotten to bring the body with it. Frank had seen this kind of vacant stillness only a few times in his career. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shock, it was disappearance. The mind walking somewhere the body couldn't follow. He swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts, but his gaze drifted back to the picture on the cardboard, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. A house. Not a messy, uneven child sketch, but a shockingly precise rendering. A two-story colonial porch, symmetrical, complete with neat window frames and a maple tree dropping the last of its autumn leaves. Every shingle on the roof was drawn. Every wooden board on the steps carried its own grain. There was even a crack in one of the top windows, so perfect, so familiar, that Frank felt his stomach lurch. He knew that house. He knew it down to the exact shape of that cracked pane of glass. And as his eyes traced the drawing again, slower this time, colder this time, he realized the boy wasn't sketching from imagination. He was drawing something real, something Frank had hoped he would never see again. Frank knew that house the way a man knows the shape of his own heartbeat. He recognized every line of the roof, every angle of the porch, every imperfect detail. He knew it because he had once carried his newborn son across that threshold, hands trembling with pride. He knew it because he had spent warm evenings on that porch while his wife tended to her flowers and their little boy chased fireflies across the yard. He knew it because for years, that house had been the center of his world. And he knew it because he could no longer bear to look at it. 2 months after Leo vanished, Frank had tried driving past, just to prove he could, but 3 blocks away he'd pulled over. shaking so violently he couldn't keep his hands on the wheel. The house had become a shrine he couldn't approach, a scar that refused to fade. But in the boy's drawing, the house wasn't scarred or changed by time. It was captured exactly as it had been 9 months earlier. The maple tree still held the same web of branches, the same pattern he had memorized from years of watching it through seasons of birthdays, holidays, and small family rituals. Even the brittle crack in the upstairs window, the one he'd always meant to fix, was perfectly placed. Frank's breath hitched. He lifted his gaze to the boy, intending to search that blank face for some clue, anything. And for the briefest flicker, a heartbeat, a blink, the child was watching him. Not past him, not through him, directly at him. Those eyes were focused, intelligent, aware. A look so sharp it felt like it cut right through Frank's chest. But the moment collapsed almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by that hollow, disconnected stare. The boy's mind had retreated again, leaving Frank wondering whether the moment had been real or a cruel trick of the dim winter light. "Where did you see this house?" Frank whispered. His own voice sounded foreign, thin, trembling at the edges. The boy stayed silent. Of course he did. Whatever was wrong with him lived far deeper than fear or shock. His breathing was steady, slow rises and falls. But that seemed to be the only evidence his body still remembered how to exist in the real world. Frank knew protocol. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Secure the area, call for medical support, notify dispatch, wait for backup. Instead, he found his hand reaching for his phone. He snapped a picture of the drawing. The camera flashed startlingly loud in the dead stillness of the classroom. And before he could second-guess himself, before he could think about what any of it meant, he bent down, slid his arms beneath the boy, and lifted him. The child weighed almost nothing. No tension in the muscles. No instinct to cling. No awareness of being moved. He hung limp in Frank's arms, head bowed, arms dangling, as though he was merely a shell filled with silence. Frank shifted his grip, pulling the boy against his chest to steady him, and that's when it hit. A sudden wave of vertigo, sharp and disorienting, like missing a step in the dark or being yanked downward by an unseen force. A cold rush swept up the back of his throat, metallic and bitter like blood or old coins. The room tilted. Then, as quickly as it came, the sensation was gone. Only a lingering cold remained, not on his skin, but deep inside his ribs, nestled somewhere behind his heartbeat, as though something had brushed against the very center of him. And as Frank carried the boy toward the exit, every instinct he had honed over 11 years whispered the same thing. He had just crossed a line he didn't understand. The sharp, metallic chill that had washed through Frank faded once he stepped outside. The October air bit at his face, sharp enough to make his eyes water, but familiar, grounding in a way the abandoned school never could be. He told himself the dizziness had been nothing more than a rush of adrenaline finally burning out. A long day, a cold building, too many memories pressed against his ribs. That explanation felt safe, ordinary. He clung to it, carrying the boy down the ruined hallway, past the broken promise of the future is canceled scrawled across the wall. Frank kept his steps slow and steady. The railing on the staircase was missing, ripped away by vandals long ago, so he hugged the wall and tightened his grip around the child's small, unmoving frame. The boy never shifted, never blinked, never reacted. Outside, the afternoon light was gray and quiet. Frank settled the boy gently into the passenger seat of his car, turned the heat up high, locked the doors, and only then, when they were sealed away from the cold and the silence of that school, did he finally call it in. The mysteries began almost immediately. No ID, no files, no record of his existence in any government system. The hospital ran every search they had access to: fingerprints, missing child reports, national databases. Nothing. The boy was a ghost. No birth certificate, no medical visits, no school enrollment. As if he had stepped out of thin air with nothing but a shredded hoodie and a broken pencil. Doctors labeled his condition as a dissociative fugue. Trauma so deep the mind barricaded itself away, leaving only a shell behind. Physically, he was undernourished and dehydrated, with the beginnings of frostbite nipping at his fingers and toes. A scattering of old scars marked his skin, some harmless, some not so easily explained. And yet, for a child who'd been living in that derelict building through nearly a year of seasons, he wasn't as broken as he should have been. Mentally, though, he was unreachable. Dr. Rashida Lim, the psychiatrist assigned to the case, spoke with a softness that suggested she'd had to give this kind of news many times before. Frank listened, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, trying not to hear what she wasn't saying. "Will he come back?" Frank asked. He hated how small his voice sounded. "Sometimes," Dr. Lim replied gently. "Sometimes the right sound, the right smell, the right moment can create a path back to themselves, a thread between then and now. But other times the separation holds. The person may return in pieces or not at all." Her words landed with a weight that pressed down heavily on Frank's chest. The state recommended emergency foster placement while they searched for relatives. A standard procedure, a safe procedure. Frank knew the rules. He recited them hundreds of times. Don't get attached. Don't take cases home. Don't let your heart make decisions your training should make for you. He should have stepped back. But the drawing wouldn't leave him alone. That house, his house, had been sketched with the kind of precision only someone who had stood on that sidewalk could capture. The maple tree, frozen in the moment before everything in Frank's life had shattered. The window crack he'd always meant to fix. The porch boards he'd replaced himself the summer before Leo disappeared. The picture was too exact, too familiar, too impossible. Frank found himself standing in the hospital hallway, staring through the glass at the boy lying motionless on the bed. Every instinct he'd honed in 11 years of social work screamed for distance. But another instinct, deeper, older, heavier, pulled him forward. The house, the tree, the child who shouldn't know any of it. None of it made sense, and yet he couldn't make himself walk away. Not this time. Not from this boy. The sketch of the tree, every branch, every vein, every flaw captured with unsettling precision, left Frank with no room to breathe. Those details weren't guesses. They were memories. His memories, somehow in that child's hands. "I'll take him," Frank said. Dr. Lim paused, her expression softening in a way that told him she knew exactly why those words had come out of his mouth. She didn't challenge him right away. She weighed her next sentence like a surgeon deciding where to cut. "Frank, you know this isn't standard procedure." "I'm a licensed foster parent," he replied too quickly. He caught his own voice wobbling and forced it steady. "My home's approved. I'm trained. I know how to handle emergency placements." Technically true, technically. Years ago, he and Natalie had gone through the whole process while they were trying to adopt. That had been before Leo arrived, before life had felt full and rooted. before everything had collapsed. After the disappearance, after Natalie ran with Leo, that's what the police record said. Frank kept the license active even though he hadn't taken a single placement in months. He had told himself it was practical, sensible, just in case. But deep down he knew the truth. Letting the license expire would have meant admitting that fatherhood was something he no longer had any claim to, and he couldn't face that. Dr. Lim folded her hands. "You know what I'm going to ask." "I'm fine," Frank said, too fast again. "I've been managing, and this boy, he needs someone who understands what real loss feels like. Someone who doesn't treat him like a puzzle to solve." A tightness clamped down in his throat, and for a moment he almost couldn't push the words out. "And there's something else," he added quieter. "That drawing my house, the tree exactly as it looked last year. Maybe whoever left him there knew me. Maybe this is connected to Leo somehow. I can't just walk away from that." The doctor's eyes filled with a sympathy he didn't want. "Frank," she said gently, "you're trying to make sense of something senseless, and I understand why. But you're asking me to approve a placement that puts you in emotional territory most people never fully escape from." "Then limit it," Frank said. 3 months. Temporary placement while you search for relatives. If nothing changes, if I can't reach him, I'll step back. I'll accept a transfer without argument, but let me try, please." Dr. Lim studied him for so long that he wondered if she was waiting for him to break down. Instead, she finally exhaled, a long, weary breath that carried resignation. 3 months, she said quietly. "No more without reassessment." Frank nodded, though his relief came with a sting of fear he didn't fully understand. His house waited in an old tree-lined neighborhood, where the branches arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The kind of place where children once chalked hopscotch grids onto cracked sidewalks and neighbors knew each other by name. Too big for one man now. 4 bedrooms, finished basement, grass in the backyard that still held the ghost of a swing set. He thought about selling after everything happened. Almost did more than once. But selling meant accepting that the laughter that had filled those rooms wasn't coming back. That the home he had built for his family now belonged to dust and memory. 9 months later, he still couldn't bring himself to put the sign in the yard. And now, for the first time in nearly a year, he wasn't going home alone. A small, stubborn part of Frank kept expecting the front door to swing open at any moment, expecting Natalie's voice calling through the hall. "I'm home. It's okay. Everything's fine. Leo's safe." He imagined them stepping through, smiling, ready to undo the nightmare that had consumed the last 9 months. But the house stayed silent, the empty rooms holding only shadows and the faint hum of the heater. He guided the boy into the guest room. It was Leo's room. The real one upstairs remained untouched, door shut, every toy, poster, and book exactly as it had been the day he vanished. But the guest room was tidy, safe, clean sheets, a window framing the backyard, a dresser with empty drawers waiting patiently for a life that hadn't arrived yet. The boy remained exactly where Frank placed him. He did not shift, did not blink except for the occasional slow, deliberate flutter. It was like living with a mannequin, but mannequins didn't breathe, didn't sigh, didn't carry that chilling, absent stare. Frank followed every suggestion from the doctor. He spoke softly, narrating each small step. "We're having breakfast now, then we'll go for a walk, and now it's time for a nap." Music played. Toys sat within easy reach. Meals were prepared slowly, methodically, each bite offered with careful hands. The boy ate when prompted, chew by chew, swallow by swallow, but nothing else broke through. He remained imprisoned within himself. On the fifth day, Frank remembered the drawings. They had been sitting in the living room, the boy perched on the couch beside him, eyes fixed on the television without really seeing it. And then Frank remembered the cereal box cardboard, the house drawn with impossible precision, the maple tree that should have been gone months ago. He stood abruptly and went to the kitchen drawer, rifling through odds and ends until he found a sketch pad, a leftover from Natalie's brief fascination with watercolors, and a mechanical pencil. He brought them to the boy, placing them gently in his lap. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. The boy stared straight ahead, unmoving, untouched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked up the pencil. His fingers gripped it as if born to it. Frank watched, his pulse quickening as lines formed on the paper. A room emerged, every piece of furniture in its place. The crooked closet door, the posters on the walls, the exact way Leo used to throw his anger into the space, leaving small imperfections behind. It was Leo's room, drawn with the same haunting precision as the house had been. Every detail painstakingly accurate, every shadow, every mark, every memory resurrected in graphite. And in that moment, Frank understood. The boy wasn't just drawn. He was reaching into the past, pulling memories out of the silence, pulling Frank into something that was both terrifying and impossible. Something in the sketch made Frank's stomach twist. Beyond the furniture, the posters, and the crooked closet, there was a figure. Small, almost ghostly, its back turned, slumped in a posture that whispered exhaustion or maybe despair. Frank's chest tightened, a cold squeeze he couldn't shake. How do you know this room?" he asked, voice trembling despite himself. The boy didn't look up. He didn't answer. His pencil never paused. It glided across the page with an eerie certainty, etching out every detail. A neat row of rocks lined the windowsill, each one collected on long walks. Glow-in-the-dark stars twinkled across the ceiling, perfectly aligned into constellations. A tiny chip in the paint where a toy truck had once left its mark in anger was drawn with absolute accuracy. Frank's hands shook, fingers tightening into fists to stop the tremor. That night sleep refused him. He lay awake, listening to the quiet creaks and sighs of the house, every subtle noise amplified in the darkness. His mind spun, trying to rationalize the impossibilities, the uncanny precision of the drawings, the delicate, exact details that only he and Natalie knew. Patterns teased meaning out of chaos, but some things could not be explained. The crack in the window haunted him. No one should have known. Leo had made it with a baseball when he was 4, a tiny spider web in the corner of the glass, visible only at certain angles under specific light. And somehow, the boy had drawn it. Morning arrived in a gray wash of light. Frank found him at the kitchen table, the sketchpad open as if it had never closed. Overnight, new lines and shapes had appeared. The boy had drawn a park, Riverside Park, the one he used to take Leo to. The perspective was perfect, from the top of the slide looking down at the playground. On the paper, a man stood by the swings, his back to the scene, posture alert, watching, waiting. Frank's hands shook as he lifted the drawing, his breath catching. On the back, a single word appeared, written with hesitant, uneven letters: "Remember." For the first time in months, Frank spoke aloud to the boy. At first, it felt absurd, like talking to the shadows. The boy gave nothing back, no glance, no gesture, no sign of comprehension. But Frank couldn't stop. For 9 months, he had avoided thinking of Leo, had buried the memories, the small fragments of a life that had been shattered. And now, in this silent, impossible presence, he found a reason, a dangerous, fragile, miraculous reason, to unlock those doors he had been so desperate to keep closed. The boy's pencil moved again, tracing lines that only Frank's heart could follow. And with every mark, the impossible became something he could almost reach. Frank's mind became the canvas, and he began with the simplest memories, the ones that still burned with warmth. The day Leo had arrived, 6 weeks early, the hospital lights harsh, hearts racing with fear and joy. The first laugh that had ripped through the quiet of the nursery, leaving Natalie sobbing with happiness. How Leo had said passetti instead of spaghetti, a mispronunciation so sweet that they'd let it linger for years, unwilling to correct him. The boy sat quietly nearby, pencil poised, expressionless, but somehow present. Every evening, Frank discovered new images in the sketchpad. A kitchen table with 3 chairs, 2 shadowed and 1 empty. A bathtub with a lone rubber duck floating. The inside of a car, the rearview mirror reflecting something Frank couldn't quite place. Each drawing was perfect, each line lifted from Frank's memory of life with Leo. "You're pulling them from me," Frank whispered one night, more to himself than the boy. "You're seeing what I remember." The boy gave no response, and yet that very night he drew a bedroom closet. In it curled a small figure, hunched in the exact way Leo used to when thunderstorms terrified him. Frank had told that story earlier that day. It should have felt invasive, wrong. Instead, it brought a pulse of something he hadn't felt in 9 months: connection. This silent, inscrutable child was reaching into Frank's mind, drawing fragments of Leo back into the world. Was it telepathy, some unnatural perception, or something beyond explanation? Frank didn't care. For the first time since the disappearance, Leo felt real again. And so Frank kept talking. He narrated every detail: Leo's obsession with dinosaurs, his encyclopedic knowledge of species and diets, the day he'd wandered off in the grocery store only to be found quietly reading cereal labels, the nightmares that only faded when Frank sang off-key lullabies until Leo drifted to sleep. The drawings began to multiply. Frank left pencils and paper in every room, and by morning they were filled. The boy no longer merely responded, he anticipated. Frank would enter a room and find a sketch of something he had been thinking about but had not yet spoken aloud. Each stroke was a whisper from the past, a puzzle piece of a life he thought lost, and the silent boy, somehow, impossibly, was putting it back together for him. One morning, Frank froze before a drawing that clawed at his stomach. It wasn't part of any story he had shared. A pigeon lay sprawled across the page, neck bent at a grotesque angle, one eye dulled and lifeless, feathers strewn like discarded hopes. In the corner, almost hidden, a tiny hand reached toward it, frail, desperate, skeletal. Frank felt bile rise. This wasn't a memory of Leo. This was something far older, harsher, a trace of the boy's months surviving alone in that crumbling school. He recalled the evidence from the art room, the torn food wrappers, the scavenged scraps, the empty bottles filled from the building's taps, the nest of cardboard and insulation tucked into a corner. But this drawing hinted at something deeper, rawer. Moments when the boy had nothing, when survival demanded primal cunning, when even dumpsters betrayed him. Hands trembling, Frank picked up the page, ready to discard it to bury the proof of what had been endured. But his gaze fell on the bottom, almost invisible, tiny scrawled letters repeating, "Trade, trade, trade," over and over, bleeding into chaos. He looked up. The boy was watching him. Not through him, not past him, but directly at him. That vacant stare still haunted the eyes, yet Frank felt a cold, deliberate intelligence behind it. A mind measuring fear, calculating, indifferent to his horror. Frank tucked the drawing into the pile with the others, trying to ignore the tightening in his chest. He told himself it was just trauma manifesting. Repetition without meaning, not a message, not a warning, not a demand. That night when he tried to summon the sound of Leo's laugh, the warmth of his voice, the memory was gone, erased, as if someone had taken it away. It was Dr. Lim who first voiced the warning. "Frank," she said during one of their weekly check-ins, "this isn't progress. He's not responding, he's withdrawing further. And the drawings, they're alarming. Incredible precision, possibly a savant-like memory, yes. But they don't mean he's reconnecting with the world. He's isolated inside himself, producing images, not engaging." Frank wanted to argue, wanted to defend the fragile thread of hope he'd found in those lines. But deep down, he knew she was right. The boy remained just as still, just as unreachable as the day Frank had stumbled upon him in that abandoned classroom. The only shift was in the drawings, meticulous, precise, haunting. But from a medical standpoint, they didn't signify progress. "We need to consider long-term care," Dr. Lim said softly, her voice measured, careful. "No," Frank replied immediately. "Just give me more time." Dr. Lim's eyes searched his, weighing the man against the child in her care, the personal desire against professional responsibility. Finally, she exhaled, a reluctant surrender. "One more month," she agreed. "But you have to be honest with yourself about what this is." Frank knew exactly what it was. He was piecing Leo back together, fragment by fragment, memory by memory. The boy may not answer with words or gestures, but through each line and shadow on the page, he was listening. He was capturing the echoes of a life Frank thought was lost. That, Frank decided, was its own language, its own miracle. That night he recounted Leo's birthdays. The chaotic 5-year-old superhero party, the magician disaster at 6 that left half the children crying, and the quiet 7th birthday, intimate and small, because Leo had insisted it be so. The next morning, the sketchbed held a new image, a lopsided sheet cake with 7 candles, carefully drawn, just like the one Natalie had made. Around the table, barely sketched in the background, were 3 figures. The smallest of them had hands clasped, eyes closed, making a wish. Frank picked it up, hands trembling. There was something in the drawing that felt off. Subtle, intangible, a flicker of unease he couldn't name or reason through. Yet he tucked it carefully into the growing stack, trying to quell the chill that spread across his chest. 3 weeks passed before he noticed the silence growing louder. One night, half asleep, he tried to summon the sound of Leo's laugh, the breathless, hiccuping laugh that always made Natalie burst into giggles, setting off a chain reaction of joy. He had heard it thousands of times. He should have been able to hear it in an instant, but it wasn't there. The memory existed, yes, the knowledge, the shape, the cadence, but the sound itself had vanished, slipping through his grasp like smoke. And with it came a realization. Some pieces of the past could be preserved on paper in images, but some, the ones that made life alive, were far harder to reclaim. Frank felt like he was grasping at smoke. He tried to summon Leo's laugh, that fragile, breathless sound that had once filled the house with warmth, but it slipped through his mind like water through cupped hands. He closed his eyes, willing it into existence, straining every muscle of memory, but it remained gone. "I'm just exhausted," he whispered to himself. "I'll hear it in the morning." Morning came and the emptiness had grown. He couldn't recall the exact shade of Leo's eyes. He knew they had been blue, soft, pale blue like Natalie's. But when he imagined them, all he could summon was a generic, flat blue, like the color of sky or sea, not the living, specific iris that had once been his son's. Desperate, he rifled through the house. Photo albums, old videos stored on his laptop, anything that bore Leo's face. The images were there, but they felt hollow, like echoes from a life that wasn't his own. In the living room, the boy sat in the chair Frank had placed him in after breakfast. The sketch pad rested in his lap, pencil moving with that uncanny, precise rhythm. Frank snatched it up. It was the 7th birthday party again, but rendered in impossible detail this time. The tablecloth pattern, the titles of the books on the shelves, Natalie's hair pulled back into the exact bun she had worn that day. Every line was meticulous, too perfect to be chance. "What are you doing?" Frank whispered, voice trembling. The boy didn't respond. His hand hovered above the paper, pencil poised, waiting. Frank's gaze traveled from the page to the boy's eyes and froze. There was something alive in them now, a calculating, deliberate awareness that went beyond catatonia, beyond trauma. "What are you doing to me?" he demanded louder. Slowly, the boy lowered his hand. Then, for the first time, he moved on his own accord. His hand reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw. Frank watched, captivated and horrified, as a new image emerged. A man's face, his own. But the eyes were wrong, hollow, desperate, hinting at something dangerous and unmoored. The boy slid the finished sketch across the table. Frank stared, knees trembling. In the background of the drawing, shadowed shapes moved. A woman running, a child being dragged, a dark building with shattered windows. And in one corner, faint, nearly unreadable, a message that made Frank's blood run cold. Like ice filling his veins, cold and unrelenting, how it had bubbled up from somewhere he didn't know existed. A dark pressure that no amount of reason or love could contain. He saw it all now, not as a story, not as a fragment, but as something he had buried beneath the surface, thinking it lost forever. The fight, the shouting, the way Natalie had tried to escape his fury, pulling at his hands, her face pale and terrified. Leo's small body trembling as he emerged from his room, caught in the storm of anger that had consumed their home that night. Frank made a sound that was part sob, part growl, raw and broken. He crumpled the sketch and hurled it across the room. "Stop it," he demanded, voice cracking. "Stop doing this." For the first time, the boy reacted in a way that made Frank's blood run cold. He tilted his head, deliberate, conscious, eyes locking on Frank with something far more than recognition. There was accusation there, or was it pleading? Frank couldn't tell. The boy picked up his pencil and began again, relentless. Frank didn't go to work that day. He couldn't leave the house, couldn't abandon the boy alone with the images that were bending memory itself. He watched every line, every stroke, hypnotized and horrified. With each new drawing, the fine, precious details of Leo began to slip from his mind. The way his hair always stubbornly stuck up at the back, the gap between his front teeth, the tiny scar on his knee from a bicycle fall. They were being replaced by outlines, by neutral, empty markers of a life once vibrant. "My son was 7, Frank whispered to himself. He liked dinosaurs. He existed. Then he was gone. And yet the memories he had tried to suppress, the ones he had locked away, were returning with brutal clarity. The raw rage that had coursed through him that night, the black ice in his chest, the fear and helplessness that had swallowed Natalie and Leo. It all surged forward, impossible to deny, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just memory. It was a reckoning, one drawn out by a silent, relentless hand, pulling him back into the shadow of the past he thought he had escaped. Frank's chest tightened, a cold pressure that seemed to squeeze every thought into a narrow, sharp focus. Memories he had spent years burying were clawing their way back, uninvited and relentless. He saw Natalie's face flash before him, pale, terrified, eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the man she had loved, the father of their child, could snap so suddenly, so violently. And Leo, He could still hear the small, helpless sobs. The way his son's tears had only fueled his own fury instead of cooling it. The drive to Bridgewater School replayed like a broken film. Leo in the back seat, clutching the door handle, pleading for mommy, for home, for some way to escape the storm that was Frank's rage. Frank's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, mind spinning with justifications he had told himself 1,000 times, protecting Leo, giving them space to calm down, planning to come back and make it right. Every excuse now rang hollow in his ears. He could feel it again, the weight of carrying Leo through the long, empty hallways. The boy had clung to him, resisted him, screamed until his voice was raw and hoarse. And when Frank finally set him down in the art room, surrounded by scattered pencils and sheets of paper, he left his son there, sobbing, with nothing but the promise of drawing to distract him. The silence of the drive home was deafening. Every turn of the wheel echoed the emptiness he had created. He remembered Natalie on the kitchen floor, the wrong rhythm of her breathing, the unnatural stillness that had prompted him to dial 911 with a calmness that belied the chaos inside him. Every word, every tone had been calculated. The perfect performance of a man returning to find his wife collapsed, his child missing. The police investigation had been almost too easy to manipulate. Natalie leaving, Leo taken. A tragedy unfolding somewhere far away. He had built the story he wanted the world to believe, and for years he had convinced himself it was the truth. Visiting Natalie in the hospital had been an act of both hope and terror. He had wished for her to awaken so he could confess, apologize, explain. And yet he had also wished she would remain in that quiet coma forever, sparing him from the reckoning of truth. He had deliberately rewritten history in his mind, recasting himself as the forsaken husband, the grieving father, the man robbed of family through circumstance rather than his own hand. That version had sustained him. He had believed it deeply, completely. But now the boy Leo was here, and with every stroke of his pencil, he was dismantling Frank's carefully constructed reality. The drawing began to take shape before Frank's wide eyes. The kitchen from that night, the room tilted at the wrong angle, the edges of tables and chairs not quite as memory dictated. Small details that no one could have known were appearing on the page. The chaos, the fear, the suppressed truths, they were emerging from the boy's hand. Frank swallowed hard, a tight lump in his throat. Every line, every curve was a thread pulling him back into a history he had fought to forget. And with that, he realized something terrifying. The boy wasn't just drawing from memory. He was unraveling the lies Frank had told himself, piece by piece, until only the raw, unvarnished truth remained. The room felt impossibly small. The world condensed into the space between the boy and the table. Frank's knees pressed against the floorboards as if he were shrinking to match the boy's perspective. On the page, Natalie recoiled, terror etched in every line of her face, while a small figure, Leo, huddled near the refrigerator, watching it all unfold. "Please," Frank's voice trembled, barely audible, a cracked whisper that barely carried across the distance. "Please stop." But Leo's hand moved with relentless purpose. Each stroke revealed Frank, exact and unflinching, every detail captured with uncanny precision. The truth no memory, no denial could hide. When the drawing was complete, the boy slid it across the table. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his eyes, meeting Frank's with a gaze that carried the weight of time and unspoken knowledge. "I remember," Leo whispered. The words were faint, broken from disuse, but they struck with crystal clarity. Frank froze, lungs catching, body locked in disbelief. Recognition, comprehension, the undeniable truth of what he had done. There it was, reflected in his son's small, haunted eyes. "I've been waiting," Leo continued, voice steady despite its fragility. "I knew you'd come back. I knew you'd find me. I knew you'd forgotten. So I had to help you remember." Frank's throat tightened. "Leo, I wasn't." "You were," the boy said softly, with a hollow certainty that left no room for argument. "You are." Something inside Frank fractured. The carefully constructed lies and stories he had clung to for so long splintering like glass. Beneath it all lay a truth too monstrous, too raw to confront directly. "Your mother, Frank, is she?" Leo's hand gestured toward the phone resting on the counter. Frank picked it up, trembling violently, fumbling through voicemail. The message was sterile, clinical, unbearable. "Mercy General Hospital. Natalie Carrick had passed away 2 nights ago. Attempts to reach next of kin had failed. Instructions for arrangements followed, mechanical and cruel." The word echoed in his mind. Body. That was all she was now, a body. Frank dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a deafening clatter that shattered the quiet of the house. I killed her," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the room. "Yes," Leo said. "You left me there. I waited. You forgot. You did it." Frank looked at his son, the fragile, broken boy who had endured 9 months of isolation, scavenging scraps, surviving on sheer will, holding onto sanity through pencil and paper, and felt the full, crushing weight of his own guilt. It landed on him like a building collapsing in slow motion, relentless and total. "I'm sorry," Frank managed, voice trembling through tears. "I'm so sorry I did." "I was, you were," Leo said again. "You are." And in that moment, Frank understood everything. The drawings had not been mere images. They had been bridges, the boy's way of leading him back, forcing him to confront the truths he had buried. Each line, each detail was a map pointing straight to the heart of what he had done, what he had allowed, and what he could never undo. The truth finally settled over Frank like a winter storm, cold and unrelenting. He realized with a sinking clarity that Leo hadn't been restoring his memories. He'd been taking them, stripping away the warm, tender moments, the fragments where Frank had been the father he longed to be, leaving only the raw, unflinching truth in their place. Every smile, every laugh, every small miracle Frank had clung to had been quietly siphoned away. And in return, Leo had handed him the reality he could no longer deny. "What do you want me to do?" Frank's voice was rough, distant, like it came from beneath water, muffled and unsure. Leo studied him, silent and unyielding, before lifting his pencil to a fresh sheet. "Watch," he said simply, and then he began to draw. Frank's eyes widened as the scene unfolded. A police station, officers moving methodically at their desks, a man striding through the door, clutching 2 small hands. The man's face was unmistakable. Every line, every expression captured perfectly. Resignation, relief, a haunting, terrible calm. When the final stroke was laid, Leo slid the drawing across the table and rose to his feet. For the first time, Frank saw him stand freely, taller than he had imagined, steadier than anyone would expect. The dead emptiness Frank had once seen in those eyes had vanished, replaced with a blazing, undeniable vitality. "I can't forget anymore," Leo said, voice firm. "So you can't either." Frank looked down at the drawing, then back at his son. Every choice, every secret, every suppressed memory surged up at once. The hospital morgue, Natalie's body, the 9 months of Leo's stolen childhood, the lie he had lived inside for so long. He thought about the man he had pretended to be and the man he had truly become. Then he rose. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for Leo's hand, and together they walked out of the house, leaving the walls of memory and deceit behind. The investigation would later reconstruct the timeline with painstaking clarity. 9 months ago, Frank Carrick had driven to the Bridgewater school with his 7-year-old son, abandoning him after an argument with his wife that had ended with her hospitalization. He had woven an intricate web of lies, convincing himself and the world that Natalie and Leo had disappeared voluntarily. The truth, however, was inescapable. Leo had survived in the desolate school through a precarious combination of ingenuity and sheer will. Running water still flowed through the pipes. He scavenged, hunted, learned to trap rats and pigeons. His catatonia upon discovery was both shield and strategy, a meticulous defense against detection by the occasional trespasser. And the drawings were a testament to something extraordinary. Doctors would later identify it as hypermnesia, a rare condition of perfect memory and recall. Every detail Leo captured, every line, every shadow, every echo of Frank's past had been meticulously observed and preserved in graphite. But it had come at a cost. He had consumed Frank's memories to do it, trading comfort for truth, innocence for revelation. And now, for the first time in nearly a year, father and son faced each other unguarded, standing on the threshold of what could be forgiveness, what could be reckoning, and what could finally be real. Leo's mind retained every detail with flawless clarity, a rare, almost impossible ability that left specialists baffled. Investigators and doctors could map out his survival, the hyper-precise recall of every room, every object, every subtle movement from his life with Frank. But the way his drawings seemed to strip Frank's memories from him was something they could barely theorize. Neurologists called it traumatic reconstruction. Frank's mind, confronted with the externalized fragments of memories he had buried, began to unravel and reorganize itself in strange ways. Psychiatrists suggested a darker possibility, that Leo had instinctively learned to manipulate his father, coaxing guilt and confession from precise observation, from the calculated way he displayed the past. No one could explain why Frank's memories faded exactly in step with the proliferation of sketches, but the experts argued over minutiae while the public saw a simple narrative. A father had abandoned his son and killed his wife, and the boy had survived. The man eventually confessed, and justice followed. Frank Carrick spent the remainder of his life behind bars. He complied with rules, never raising his voice, never drawing attention. But fellow inmates felt it immediately. There was a hollowness to him, an absence inside that made him unnerving to be around. Something essential had been stripped away, leaving only a quiet, empty shell. Leo moved to Seattle to live with his maternal grandmother. He continued drawing, quietly and obsessively, but never showed his work to anyone. Sometimes, she would hear him crying softly in the night, or find him standing at 3 a.m. in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection, expression unreadable, distant, and strange. When reporters asked about his experience, Leo would only say he had been waiting for his father to remember, waiting for someone to come, waiting for a place to call home again. He never spoke of the drawings, and no one thought to ask. Those images, hundreds of them, had been collected as evidence and filed away in a storage facility, a silent archive of a childhood that now existed only in graphite and paper. Years later, Leo would reflect on those months in the abandoned school, on what he had learned about himself and the strange power of his drawings. At first, they had been a lifeline, a way to hold on to reality when all else was decay and neglect. Each sketch, birthday parties, bedtime stories, ordinary afternoons, was a small anchor, a way to make his memories concrete, to pull them back from the void. And in doing so, he had found a way to reach out, to force his father to see the truth, to confront what had been hidden for so long. Drawing became more than survival. It became control, understanding, and in the end, a bridge between what was lost and what could never be reclaimed. Every pencil stroke was a testament that even in the darkest, loneliest places, memory and truth could endure, waiting for someone to finally see them. The endless hunger, the gnawing ache in his stomach that made every scrap of food a miracle. He remembered the scavenge for scraps in trash bins, the pigeons he trapped, the small victories that kept him alive, and the crushing fear when the building creaked in the empty nights. Every sound, every shadow, every faint glimmer of hope was etched into him as sharply as the memories of his father's house before it all collapsed. And yet in that relentless recall there was purpose. Every memory became a thread, woven into the sketches he sent forward, back to the father who had forgotten him. Each pencil stroke was deliberate, precise, a beacon aimed straight at Frank's conscience. He remembered the shape of the classroom desks, the angle of the light through the broken windows, the smell of dust and cold metal. He remembered the exact way his father had seemed to vanish, how silence had replaced love, and how the world had narrowed to the rhythm of survival. The cost was immense. Leo could never unremember these months. The trauma was stitched into him as tightly as the skills he had honed to endure them. Every sensation, every pang of hunger, every fleeting terror, every tiny triumph was vivid, permanent. The boy who had once simply wanted to survive had become a vessel of history, his own history, and the truth of what Frank had done. But there was also clarity. With each drawing, each careful reproduction of the past, Leo shaped a pathway. A map not just of memory, but of reckoning. The thread connecting him to Frank grew taut with inevitability. And when the day came when Frank finally returned to the art room, it was not by chance. It was destiny, drawn forward by the patient, relentless force of a child who had learned to wait, to endure, and to ensure that the truth would finally be seen. Leo had learned long ago that survival demanded a reckoning with despair. There were nights when the shadow of death pressed against him so close, he could almost touch it. But instead of surrendering, he clung to life with a stubborn, searing defiance that burned hotter than fear itself. Every moment from those 9 months was etched into him, unyielding, impossible to erase. His grandmother tried to guide him toward healing, setting him in soft chairs, leading him through the rituals of therapy. Leo obeyed, answering questions in measured, quiet tones, but he revealed nothing of the truth that mattered. He never spoke of the thread that stretched across miles and memories, linking him to his father. He never mentioned the drawings or the way they had been instruments of revelation, of reclamation. Even now, surrounded by locks, alarms, and the warm safety of a home that wanted to shelter him, Leo could feel the invisible thread stretching from him to everyone around him. His grandmother, steeped in recollections of his mother. His uncle, visiting with forced laughter and eyes that skirted the child he had become. The therapist, poised with neutral sympathy, her own traumas tucked beneath her professional mask. Every thread was a doorway, every memory a key. He could reach inside, borrow fragments, trade comfort for truth, but he didn't. That restraint was vital. Some nights, however, the weight of the past pressed too heavily. When the darkness of those 9 months pressed in, Leo would pull out his sketch pad. He would draw his grandmother asleep in her quiet room, her face soft in the dim light. He would capture his uncle mid-laugh, frozen in a moment he had never witnessed. He would sketch the therapist, tear-streaked and unguarded, her sorrow his alone for a heartbeat. For a fleeting moment, holding these glimpses in his hands, he felt something other than the burden of what had happened to him. He felt the faintest taste of agency, of control, of connection. Then the pad was closed. hidden beneath his bed, and the hours counted down until dawn, until freedom, until a day when he could be more than the boy who had endured the darkness. The day Frank faced judgment, Leo sat quietly in the courtroom observing. His father stood, finally stripped of pretense, answering for every choice that had shattered their lives. Lawyers sparred over culpability, one arguing Frank's mind had fractured under the weight of guilt, another demanding full reckoning, painting him as a man who had chosen self-preservation over truth, who had abandoned a wife and child rather than face the consequences. Leo watched, his gaze steady. He felt the truth settle around him, immutable and piercing, and somewhere deep inside, he understood the full measure of what had been lost, what had been endured, and what had been won. The courtroom, the legal arguments, the judgments of strangers, they mattered less than the quiet victories of a child who had survived, who had remembered, who had reclaimed the story for himself. The gavel fell, final and unforgiving. Frank rose to hear his sentence, life without parole. His face remained unreadable, a mask concealing the storm inside. His eyes were fixed on some distant point, a place beyond the courtroom walls, beyond everyone present. When the officers took him away, handcuffed and silent, he didn't glance at Leo, not once. He didn't acknowledge anyone. Leo's grandmother had offered him the choice to stay or leave, to witness the full reckoning or spare himself the spectacle. He had stayed. He needed to see this chapter close, to witness the ending he had quietly carved into reality through months of pencil and paper. But as the room emptied and the echoes of footsteps faded, Leo felt an unexpected hollowness. Justice had been served. His father was locked away, his mother gone, the scales balanced. Yet satisfaction remained elusive. It was as if some piece of himself had been left behind in the empty courtroom. On the drive back to Seattle, Leo pressed his forehead to the cool glass of the car window, watching the world slip past in streaks of green and gray. Fields blurred into suburbs, suburbs into city. Everything moved forward unrelenting, while Leo remained suspended in amber, frozen within the 9 months that had shaped him irrevocably. His grandmother reached over, her hand warm, squeezing his. "It's over now," she said softly. He nodded, because that was what she needed him to do. But it wasn't over. It would never be over. Every night, every closed eye brought him back to that art room, pencil in hand, drawing lines towards salvation or damnation. He could never tell which. In the mirror, he saw the boy abandoned by his father, the boy who had survived impossible odds, the boy who had learned to reach into minds and extract truth with unflinching precision. And the question that haunted him most, had his father created this monster, or had it always been inside him, waiting for a reason to awaken? Perhaps the ability to draw out memories, to bend perception, had always been dormant, lying in wait for trauma to ignite it. Perhaps any child facing the same abandonment and terror could have risen to this power. Or perhaps Leo had always been something else, something beyond entirely human, and Frank had simply been the catalyst. He didn't know which possibility terrified him more. The last time Leo drew his father came 5 years later. He was 17, living quietly in his grandmother's home, a ghost moving through rooms without leaving a trace. He had learned to mimic normality, to blend, to exist without drawing attention. He worked at a bookstore, attended community college classes, and from the outside, he seemed almost ordinary. But inside, the echoes of that art room, the power and the memory, lingered, waiting silently behind every stroke of pencil, behind every quiet moment. Night after night, the memories haunted him, relentless and unyielding. Sleep offered no sanctuary. The dreams always returned him to that cold, echoing school, to the hollow hallways where the air smelled of dust and despair. But now the dreams had a cruel twist. In them his father returned, not as the man who had left him, but as the one Leo had forced to remember. Frank would step into the art room, arms outstretched, tears carving tracks down his face, voice trembling with apology. He would beg for forgiveness, for redemption, and for a fleeting moment, Leo allowed himself to believe it. The warmth of being found, of being finally safe, of reclaiming the father he'd mourned for so long. Then the dream ended. He woke, chest tight, staring at the ceiling, and the truth hit him like ice water. His father's return had only been possible because Leo had demanded it. Every cherished, joyful memory had been stripped away until only the raw, unvarnished truth remained. The love Frank carried, such as it was, had been conditional, tethered to forgetting. When confronted with the full weight of remembrance, Frank had chosen punishment over illusion, prison over comfort. One sleepless night, Leo lifted his sketch pad. He had one final image to capture, one final act to seal the story in his own hands. He drew his father as he had stood in that kitchen on the day they had walked out together, the day everything had collapsed into irrevocable history. Frank's expression was impossible to describe in a single word, neither relief nor peace, but a bitter, aching clarity. The look of a man who had stopped running, who had faced the darkness inside himself and realized it was worse than any punishment the outside world could deliver. Pain, surrender, acceptance, liberation. Every subtle curve and shadow of it pressed onto the page through Leo's careful hand. As the lines took shape, a thread between father and son tightened, vibrating with something raw and unspoken. A memory passed along it, not stolen but offered. A fragment from the past, years before the fractures, when Leo had been small, laughing, innocent. He remembered falling off the swing in their backyard at age 4 or 5, his body trembling with shock, tears more from surprise than from pain. Frank had been there instantly, scooping him into his arms, checking him over, face pale with fear, voice full of tenderness. He had held Leo close, sung that familiar, off-key melody, and watched the crying transform into hiccups and then into laughter. In that memory, Frank's face radiated a love so raw and untainted it almost hurt to witness. This was the father Leo had lost twice, once to abandonment, once to the unbearable truth. Leo held the drawing before him, studying it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Then, with quiet deliberation, he tore it into fragments. Piece by piece, he fed it to the toilet, letting the final image of that impossible, perfect love vanish forever. He didn't want that memory, the warmth of a father's arms, the quiet reassurance of love that had been real and yet utterly destroyed. He didn't want it to tangle the neat, sharp lines of survival he had drawn for himself, the story of victim and monster that had kept him alive. Yet the memory lingered, stubborn and undeniable, now his as much as it had once belonged to Frank. And Leo understood with a hollow ache that this was the ultimate punishment his father would carry. Not bars, not isolation, not public disgrace, but the haunting truth that he had once loved and still had failed, and that love could not be reclaimed. For Leo, the punishment was different, but equally inescapable. The knowledge that the man who abandoned him had loved him first, and that even love could not prevent destruction. On his 18th birthday, he left his grandmother's house without explanation. He headed north, somewhere remote and cold, Canada, Alaska, a place where memories could be distant if never erased. He packed light, a few changes of clothes, books, sketch pads, pencils. That was all he needed. She cried as he left, pleading for him to stay, to accept help, to let therapy heal him. He hugged her tightly and promised he'd be fine. They both knew it was a lie. On the road, in lonely motels and quiet diners, Leo maintained the barest semblance of normalcy. He interacted just enough to remain invisible in plain sight, but never enough to let anyone in. Every free moment was spent drawing, sketch pad after sketch pad filled with fragments of his past, dreams, imagined faces, strangers unknowingly immortalized on paper. He never touched those threads in others, minds the way he had with his father. He knew the cost of taking without consent. The scars it left, invisible but permanent, were too high a price to pay. Yet at night, in the dim light of motel rooms, he could feel it all. The invisible threads connecting him to every person he had ever met, every life he had brushed against. His grandmother, his uncle, therapists, classmates, customers at the bookstore, each linked by invisible strands. Beyond them, the web stretched endlessly, a vast lattice of human thought and memory, waiting if he chose to reach. The temptation to share the weight of what he carried, to make the world remember Bridgewater School so he wouldn't have to bear it alone, was immense. He never did, but the knowledge that he could, that the power existed at his fingertips, was enough. It was a quiet, terrible reminder of what had been taken from him and what he had become. A boy who could remember everything, touch every mind, yet choose restraint, surviving the weight of a world few could even imagine. The weight of choice had etched itself into Leo in a way that left no room for innocence. He understood painfully that every person carried a moment where comfort clashed with conscience, where a single decision could crush another life. His father had made that choice once, and then buried it, turned away from the truth. Leo confronted it every day, forcing himself to live inside it, unflinching. That was their divergence, not victim versus villain, but the courage to face reality versus the desperate need to hide from it. And Leo was learning that living with the truth was its own unbreakable confinement. No bars, no guards, no release. The last anyone heard, Leo Carrick had settled in a small, wind-bitten town outside Anchorage, working in a fish processing plant. He lived alone in a weathered cabin on the forest's edge, keeping himself distant, silent, nearly invisible. The few encounters townspeople had with him left them with the impression of politeness tinged with inaccessibility. A man, or boy, always elsewhere in thought. Yet he left traces. Hikers would sometimes stumble upon delicate drawings tucked in tree hollows or pinned beneath stones along forgotten trails. Scenes at once hauntingly familiar and impossibly distant. Bedrooms that could belong to anyone. Family dinners blurred into obscurity. Moments of joy captured with such precision, they seemed more alive than memory itself. No one knew who left these pieces behind, or why. Most assumed some wandering artist, quietly practicing meditation through sketching. But for those who looked closely, a pattern emerged. In the background of many drawings, a small boy appeared again and again, 7 or 8 years old, pressed to walls, hiding in corners, gazing out windows at a world that had forgotten him. And always in the careful curve of his hands, the pencil remained, still drawing, still remembering, still waiting. Waiting for a kind of grace no time, no distance could ever grant. The impossible mercy of being allowed to forget, yet choosing never to. Story 2, the last one on. Penelope Hartwell liked control. At 43, she balanced her bank account down to the last cent, carried pepper spray just in case, and always left a clear itinerary with a friend when traveling. So when she stepped into the chaos of Phoenix Greyhound Terminal that night, her instincts screamed that something was off. Construction had turned the station into a labyrinth. Makeshift barriers funneled travelers in impossible loops, hand-lettered signs threatened to mislead, and harsh floodlights painted everything in an unflattering, industrial glare. Even spaces she thought she knew suddenly felt alien. "Bus to Tucson," she called to a man in coveralls, his clipboard the only thing grounding him amid the jackhammer percussion. He barely glanced at her, gesturing vaguely down a rough pavement path. "Gate 7, he muttered, almost as an afterthought. Pushing her suitcase over cracked asphalt, Penelope followed, the uneven surface rattling her resolve as much as her luggage. The path led away from the main terminal into a utilitarian lot. Buses lined up like sentinels under dim lights. Gate 7 was nothing more than a hand-written sign taped crookedly to a concrete post. One bus sat there, engine humming softly, interior lights casting faint, uneven glows. A man in a dirty coverall leaned against it, eyes fixed on a clipboard. "Tucson?" she asked again, ticket in hand. He squinted, then waved her aboard without ceremony. The interior was empty, completely unsettlingly empty, not a single passenger in sight. The overhead lights made some areas painfully bright while others sank into unnatural shadows. Penelope froze mid-aisle. She'd taken late buses before, but never like this. Never this silent. She chose seat 14, a habit born from years of traveling, though there was no driver to appease, no other riders to blend in with. The man outside methodically checked boxes on his clipboard, then slid into the driver's seat without a word. The bus shuddered, then moved, its familiar rumbles and sways oddly distorted in the silence. The route immediately felt wrong. Industrial backroads replaced the highways she expected. She tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself she was just anxious, that late-night deviations were normal. But the unease kept crawling up her spine, unrelenting. Minutes passed. Streetlights flickered past like distant stars she couldn't reach. Shadows seemed to stretch inside the bus, bending in ways that made the seats feel closer, the aisle narrower. Penelope's grip tightened on the armrest. Every instinct screamed. This was not just a bus ride. Something had shifted. She tried to tell herself a story. Late schedule, quiet route, nothing more. But deep down, she knew the truth. The emptiness was deliberate. The silence was too perfect. And as the bus wound deeper into unknown industrial veins, she realized tonight she was the last one on, and this journey would not follow the rules she knew. And somewhere beneath the fluorescent glare and the low hum of the engine, the air seemed to wait, watching, patient, like the world had closed the doors and now only she remained. She told herself it was just a detour, a late-night schedule oddity, but the unease clung like a shadow. The bus had taken odd turns before, weaving through back roads to dodge construction or clogged streets. Maybe this was just one of those nights. Maybe the emptiness was harmless. Plenty of space to stretch, maybe even catch some sleep. She opened her paperback, letting the dim overhead light illuminate the page, but the shadows cast by the flickering bulbs made reading a strain. Silence pressed against her from every angle, heavy and patient, and the hum of the engine, meant to soothe, only deepened her restlessness. And yet, her eyelids betrayed her, drooping, surrendering to a lullaby she didn't want to hear. In sleep, the lines between memory and imagination blurred. She was in Tucson again, wandering her mother's kitchen on a sunlit afternoon, laughing with her sister Judith. Then the warmth twisted into something unfamiliar. Streets she knew melted into shifting alleys. Houses vanished as she approached. Voices whispered her name, but the air held no one when she turned. The dream spiraled. She woke abruptly. The book had slipped from her hands, her neck sore against the window. That familiar wrongness had deepened into something wrong, something bordering on panic. The bus was still empty, but now that emptiness wasn't odd. It was threatening. She was alone, completely alone. And the man behind the wheel, her heart slammed at the sight, was not the same one she had boarded with. The coveralls were gone, replaced by a dark jacket. The calm, methodical posture had vanished, replaced by a rigid, almost frantic energy. Sandy hair, pale neck, white-knuckled grip on the wheel. This was not the worker who had waved her aboard. Her pulse shot up. How long had she slept? Where was the first driver? And most terrifying, what had become of the route she thought she knew? The highway stretched ahead, but every sign, every curve was unfamiliar. The asphalt flew beneath them faster than any bus should have dared, hypnotic and menacing. She fumbled for her phone. No signal. Nothing. Not unusual in rural Arizona. But in that moment, it felt like another wall closing in. Another barrier separating her from anyone who could help. Rational explanations began to crumble. No bus driver simply swapped out mid-route. No schedule misalignment created this kind of dread. She was trapped in the slow, accelerating realization that tonight, nothing was ordinary, and nothing would be explained. Strayed into something planned, something waiting for her in the shadows of that empty terminal. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the bus wound higher into hills that shouldn't have been there. The desert stretched below in jagged, unnatural patterns, like a landscape painted wrong. Each turn made her stomach twist. Each shadow cast by the headlights made her flinch. The man at the wheel didn't glance back. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, but there was a tension that went beyond urgency. There was fear, raw and immediate, radiating from him in waves. Penelope pressed herself into her seat, knuckles white against the armrest. Every instinct screamed at her, get off, run, escape. But the bus was sealed, the doors locked, and the windows too high to climb. She tried to think. Could she make a move? If she yelled, would anyone hear? The only sound was the engine, thrum and vibration vibrating through the floor, and the wind rushing past the bus like it carried secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Her phone had no signal, no help, nothing. The road curved sharply, and the bus leaned with it, throwing her slightly against her seatbelt. Panic sharpened her awareness. The desert outside looked like nothing she had ever seen. Rocks and scrub twisted into unfamiliar formations, hills looming in angles that made no sense with the map in her head. The sense of dislocation was suffocating. And then the horrifying possibility struck her. She hadn't wandered into the wrong bus by accident. What if someone had been waiting for her, watching, planning? The original maintenance worker had been a lure, a bait, the casual instruction to Gate 7, now feeling like part of a trap meticulously set. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding with adrenaline. Who was he? What did he want? And most importantly, was she going to survive long enough to figure it out? The bus hurtled onward, and for the first time she understood the full scope of her helplessness. Alone, trapped, racing toward an unknown destination with a stranger whose desperation dwarfed her own. And in that creeping, suffocating darkness, she realized the terrifying truth. Nothing about this night was ordinary, and nothing would be safe again. Assets, nothing that could justify this. And yet here she was, alone on a bus hurtling through an alien desert night, every mile stretching farther from the world she knew. Her stomach knotted with the impossible realization. It wasn't random. Every misstep, every moment that had seemed inconvenient, the construction detours, the empty bus, the isolated gate, had been part of a chain designed to bring her here. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The driver's profile was sharp in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, jaw tight, hands gripping the wheel like the entire world depended on it. There was a nervous energy that vibrated from him, a tension that seemed almost predatory, not toward her, but something unseen. "You're awake," he said again, voice low and flat, carrying across the hollow bus like a declaration rather than an observation. Her skin prickled. The words weren't a question. They were confirmation, the first real acknowledgement that her presence had been anticipated, expected even. She stayed silent, heart hammering, mind racing for any escape plan that didn't exist. "I suppose you're wondering what happened," he continued, eyes flicking briefly to the mirror, then back to the road. "Where the other driver went, why you're here." Her throat tightened, words caught in her chest. Where is he?" she managed, voice shaking. "Safe," he replied, almost too quickly, his tone edged with forced reassurance. "I left him at the maintenance yard, tied up but safe. He'll be found in the morning." The lie was thick, obvious, delivered with a precision meant to convince and disarm simultaneously. Penelope forced a nod, knowing her compliance might be her only shield for the moment. "And where are we going?" she asked cautiously, swallowing the lump in her throat. Just taking a different route," he muttered, eyes never leaving the road. Another lie, thin and unconvincing, but again she nodded, playing the part of the calm, cooperative passenger. "I'm sorry if this seems irregular," he added, his voice smoother now, rehearsed, almost polite. "You'll still arrive on time." The politeness was worse than outright threats. It carried the weight of preparation, of careful plotting. Every gesture, every word, hinted at a methodical design that had been in motion long before she had stepped onto the bus. Her mind reeled, piecing together the fragments. The construction chaos, the maze of detours, the maintenance workers' vague instructions, the isolated gate, the inattentive ticket checker, all of it assembling into a horrifying truth. She hadn't wandered here by accident. She had been herded, manipulated, led deliberately into isolation, into the hands of someone whose intentions she could barely fathom. And in that stark, desert-black night, hurtling toward an unknown fate, the question burned hotter than fear itself. Why her? What could a solitary accountant with no wealth, no influence, no ties, possibly represent to someone capable of this? The answer eluded her, leaving only the cold, terrifying certainty that she was utterly alone, at the mercy of a stranger whose plan was still unfolding. The empty bus, the impossibly fast pace through unrecognizable desert roads, all of it slotted together like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to see completed. Her heart thudded, each beat hammering against the realization that she had not been lucky or unlucky. She had been chosen, guided, and whatever had led her here, it wasn't random. The young man's eyes held her, sharp and unnervingly calm now, as if he could see the storm of thoughts racing behind her skull. "You've been here before," he said quietly, "but not like this, not fully awake." His words settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't imagining it. She had been observed, her movements noted, her confusion anticipated. Every misstep, every hesitation, every instinct had been accounted for. She clenched her fingers around the pepper spray, nails biting into the metal casing, though she knew it might not be enough. He had control, and this isolated rest stop offered no witnesses, no escape. The hum of the engine, the faint whine of the wind through the cracked windows, the endless stretch of darkness outside, it all pressed against her, compressing her thoughts into a single, terrifying focus: survival. "You need to understand," he continued, his tone softening just enough to unsettle her further. "What you think is happening is. You are not where you believe you are. Nothing tonight is what it seems." The words slithered through her mind, igniting every shadow of doubt she'd been pushing aside. The barriers, the cones, the detours, the empty bus, they weren't accidents. They were all part of a carefully orchestrated plan, designed to remove her from the world she knew and place her somewhere entirely controlled. Penelope's pulse raced. Each rational explanation she clung to collapsed under the weight of the new perspective. She tried to summon anger to rally defiance, but it was tempered by the undeniable truth she felt in her bones. She was utterly isolated, entirely at the mercy of someone who had anticipated her every move. And yet in the depths of fear, a tiny, stubborn flicker of determination ignited. She wouldn't panic. She would watch. She would wait. Every detail, every twitch of his expression, every hesitation in his movements would be noted. And when the moment came, whatever that moment would be, she would remember it all. Because if she survived, she would make sure that nothing about this night could ever be repeated. The bus sat in the empty lot, engine idling, lights casting stark, unnatural shadows over cracked asphalt. The rest stopped, silent and forgotten, seemed to breathe around them. Penelope's hand hovered over the pepper spray, fingers trembling. And for the first time she understood fully. The journey she had unwittingly boarded was far from over. The night was only beginning, and the line between escape and capture had just been drawn. The weight of the law pressing down on her, of course she would talk. Anyone would. And that truth, simple, human, inevitable, hung between them like a noose tightening around both their throats. Penelope swallowed, feeling her pulse thumping in her ears. The bus cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. The gun wasn't aimed at her, yet its presence changed everything. It marked a line in the sand, one she had never imagined crossing in her entire orderly, predictable life. "Please," she whispered, not begging, just asking for clarity, a foothold in this night that had spun completely out of control. "What are you going to do with me?" He ran a shaky hand through his hair, the mask of forced calm slipping for the first time. She saw the truth behind his eyes. Not cruelty, not calculation, just fear. A desperate, cornered fear. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not a killer. I didn't shoot that clerk. I didn't plan any of this. I ran. And then you showed up. Wrong place, wrong bus, wrong night." His voice broke slightly, and she felt a strange, unsettling tug of sympathy. He wasn't a monster. He was a foolish, frightened young man who had made every wrong choice in the span of a single hour. But fear, she knew, could turn even decent men into something dangerous. He looked out the windshield, scanning the darkness around the abandoned rest stop as if expecting headlights to crest the highway at any moment. "They'll be looking for me," he murmured. "Once they find the clerk and once they check the cameras, they'll put it together. And they'll put it on the news. And they'll track this bus. They'll track me." "And me," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. A cold tremor passed through her. The life she built carefully, sensibly, predictably, a life of routine, safety, and control, was unraveling thread by thread. She didn't deserve this. She hadn't caused this. And yet she was trapped in it all the same. "There has to be another way," she said, steadying her voice, appealing not to his fear but to the part of him still clinging to sanity. "You don't have to hurt me. We can think of something else. Something that doesn't destroy both of us." For a moment something flickered in his expression, hope, doubt, humanity. But just as quickly it vanished. "Maybe," he said, "but not here, not yet. We need to move before someone drives by, before someone sees the bus." He tightened his grip on the gun, not threatening her, but reminding both of them what was at stake. Penelope's breath caught. The night outside felt ancient, vast, and merciless, and she realized with a chill that went all the way to her bones. This was no longer about a wrong bus. This was about survival. And the choices they made in the next few minutes would decide everything. Penelope's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat, the reality of his words settling over her like a weighted blanket, heavy, suffocating, impossible to escape. Both in serious trouble. It wasn't melodrama. It wasn't manipulation. It was the quiet truth of two lives drifting toward the same cliff, tied together by nothing but circumstance and fear. Trevor's knuckles were white around the steering wheel. His eyes, sharp but exhausted, kept darting between the road and the mirrors, watching for police, for headlights, for fate itself catching up. He looked like a man running from more than just the law. He looked like a man running from himself. Penelope swallowed hard. And if the police stop us? His jaw flexed. They'll assume we're together, that you're helping me escape. But I'm not. Doesn't matter, you're on a stolen bus. With me, with a gun, that's all they'll see. The truth hit like a blow. Her innocence didn't matter anymore. Her history, her predictability, her quiet, ordinary life, none of it mattered. In the eyes of the world, she and Trevor were already a story, a headline, a pair. She stared out into the darkness passing by the windows, a blur of desert shadows under a moon that felt too indifferent for the moment. Trevor, I need you to be honest with me. He didn't look at her, but she saw his throat move as he swallowed. About what? About whether I'm going to make it out of this alive. The silence that followed was worse than an answer. At last he spoke softly, reluctantly, like someone peeling back a wound. I don't want to hurt you, I mean it. But you will, she said, voice trembling, if you think you have no other choice. He winced, the truth landing between them again, undeniable. I'm trying to find another way. I'm trying to buy time, but time running out for both of us. She studied him, really studied him. The thin frame, the trembling hands, the fear simmering under every word. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was someone who had spent his whole life running from consequences until one night forced them all to the surface. And now she was caught in the same current. Trevor, she whispered, voice steadying with a courage she didn't feel. If you want us to survive, you need to trust me. I'm not your enemy. He let out a shaky laugh, hollow and pained. Trust is dangerous. So is panic, she said. And that's what's killing us right now. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just breathed, ragged, uneven, human. Then finally he nodded, barely. I'm trying, he murmured. But every mile we drive, every minute that passes, the walls get tighter. Penelope felt her pulse steady. Not calm, never calm, but focused, determined. She didn't choose this path, but if she wanted to live, she had to walk it with clarity, not fear. Then, she said quietly, let's figure this out before the walls close completely. Trevor's eyes flicked toward her in the rearview mirror, haunted, uncertain, but searching for hope. Maybe even clinging to it. Because now they weren't just a kidnapper and a hostage. They were two people bound to the same fate. And the night was far from over. Penelope felt the engine rumble beneath her feet as the travel plaza drew closer. A lonely island of fluorescent light in an ocean of darkness. It should have felt like salvation, like the first sign of civilization after hours of terror. But instead, her pulse quickened with a dread she couldn't quite name. Trevor wasn't slowing down because he had a plan. He was slowing down because he was out of plans. The bus coasted into the lot, weaving between semis that slept like hulking beasts, their engines silent, drivers locked in their own worlds of rest or exhaustion. Trevor parked behind a line of trucks, far enough from the pumps to avoid being noticed, close enough to people that he could blend in. He killed the headlights but left the engine idling, a heartbeat in the metal, steady and low. Penelope's breath fogged the window. Trevor, if we go out there, what do you expect me to do? Just follow you. His fingers drummed nervously on the wheel. I expect you not to run. And if I do? He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Her mind conjured flashes of every bad outcome. Him grabbing her, the gun firing, people screaming, police swarming. Her name plastered across headlines she never wanted to be part of. Trevor rubbed his face with both hands, exhausted, shaking slightly. Look, I don't want to hurt anyone. Not you, not them. I can't get caught. Not yet. Not like this. Trevor, she said softly, you said you didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't. His voice cracked. 20 minutes before that robbery, I was trying to decide if I had enough money to buy a sandwich. Now I'm here, with you, on a stolen bus, running from a murder I didn't commit. She believed him, at least about that, but belief didn't undo danger. The parking lot glowed a sickly yellow, buzzing faintly with fluorescent hum. Families getting an early start, truckers stretching their legs, teenagers in hoodies heading toward the convenience store for snacks. People witnesses, lives untouched by this nightmare. And she was about to step out among them with a man who could unravel at any second. Trevor hesitated, looking at her again through the mirror. If you scream, everything ends right here. It'll get loud. Someone will call the cops. They'll come in fast and hot. You might get hurt. I might get killed. His voice shook, not with threat, but with fear. Real fear. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was begging her to understand the stakes. Do you trust me? He asked. She almost laughed. Trust. It felt absurd. But in the twisted logic of their situation, trust was the only currency left. I trust that you don't want anyone to die, she said. That's all I've got, he whispered. The engine hummed. Outside, the world kept moving, normal, steady, oblivious. Penelope stood slowly, gripping the rail beside her seat. Her legs trembled. She could scream the moment the bus door opened. She could run. She could throw herself at the mercy of strangers and hope they believed her story. But Trevor had nothing to lose, and men with nothing to lose made desperate, irreversible decisions. She swallowed. Okay, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. Trevor exhaled with a relief so heavy it almost sagged his entire frame. We're going to walk out together, calm, normal, like two travelers grabbing supplies. No one will look twice. And after that, she asked. He met her eyes in the mirror, haunted, raw, pleading. After that, we survived the next 5 minutes. Then the next 5. That's all I know. It wasn't a plan, but it was all they had. He reached for the door, and Penelope felt the world tilt, the moment balancing on a knife's edge as the cool desert air rushed into the bus, and the darkness outside waited to swallow them both. Trevor guided the bus quietly into the sprawling travel plaza, weaving between idling semis and parked cars, his eyes scanning for a place to disappear. He spotted it behind a line of towering cattle trucks, their shadowed sides forming a perfect screen from the main lot. Here, he muttered, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was jarring, the hum of the plaza's neon lights and distant generators growing louder in contrast. Penelope's chest tightened. Every ordinary sound, footsteps, a distant horn, the chatter of early morning travelers, now felt like it could betray them. What do we take? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. As little as possible, Trevor replied, scanning their surroundings, just enough to blend in. She collected her purse, feeling the weight of the pepper spray, useless against the chaos she was already trapped in. Trevor slid cash into his pocket and made sure the gun was concealed, his movements precise, deliberate. Ready? He asked. No, she wanted to scream. I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready to be a fugitive, a hostage, anything. But she couldn't say that. Instead, she nodded. Yes. The door opened, and the desert air wrapped around them, cold and sharp with the first hints of dawn. The sky bled deep purple, the horizon hinting at the coming day. The bus now stood exposed behind them, and every second counted. People moved through the plaza, sleepy truckers and weary travelers creating an ideal crowd to slip into, to vanish among. Act normal, Trevor whispered. Penelope forced herself into the posture of a tired commuter, dragging her feet, eyes half-lidded. It was easier than she expected, exhaustion masking fear. Inside, the fluorescent lights stung, humming a monotonous, relentless tune. Trevor headed toward the restrooms, and she followed, grateful for a few moments to catch her racing thoughts. When she re-emerged, he was crouched over a wall map near the information desk, tracing routes with a finger. "Where are we?" she asked, voice low, cautious. "About 60 miles southeast of Phoenix," he said. His gaze didn't leave the map. "And Tucson?" "Maybe 90 miles, but we're not going there." Her stomach nodded. Of course not. Tucson was the place everyone expected her to be, the place her sister would call the police, the place her absence would spark alarms. "So where are we going?" she asked, trying to mask the panic in her voice. Trevor shrugged slightly, eyes scanning highways and towns, their lines and dots forming a labyrinth of escape. "I don't know yet." She studied the map herself. High desert country, scattered mining towns, roads winding through scrub and rock. Ideal for hiding, terrible for finding help. A sudden noise at the entrance made them both pause. 2 uniformed officers had entered, speaking with the convenience store manager. One held a photograph, flipping it in his hands, studying it intently. Penelope froze. Every instinct screamed danger. Their carefully constructed illusion of invisibility could collapse in a heartbeat. And in that moment she realized they were no longer just on the run. They were being hunted. Trevor didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the dark highway, the rising dawn washing the desert in a cold, silvery glow. When he finally spoke, his voice felt smaller than before, less confident, more real. "Could be minutes, could be an hour," he said. "Depends when the owner comes out." Minutes, an hour. Their lives now swung between those fragile windows of time. Penelope felt the weight of it all settling hard on her chest. The stolen bus, the murder she had nothing to do with, the truck they now rode in, the officers standing just a few hundred feet away from her moments ago. Her life, which had always been neat, predictable, respectable, was now tangled in crimes she could never have imagined herself involved in. And yet here she was, running, hopping, surviving beside a man she barely understood. "You're shaking," Trevor said quietly. "I'm aware," she replied, folding her hands tightly in her lap as if she could keep herself from falling apart simply by holding still. They drove in silence for several miles, the sun lifting slowly behind them, stretching long shadows across the empty road. With the light came clarity and dread. The truck's interior seemed too open, too visible. They were exposed now in a way they hadn't been in the anonymity of the night. "What's the plan?" she finally asked, her voice raw. "Where are we even going?" Trevor hesitated. She saw his jaw clench, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We need someplace to hide for a few hours, somewhere isolated." "Trevor, isolated places are where people get killed." "I'm not going to hurt you," he said sharply. Then softer, "I swear I'm not." "But you see how none of this looks good for me, right?" she said. I'm driving through the desert in a stolen truck with a man who stole a bus and witnessed a murder. How do I explain that to anyone?" Her voice cracked, the truth too heavy to hold inside. Trevor exhaled, his expression tortured. I know, but we're too deep in this now. You walk into a police station and tell them everything, they'll say you ran with me, that you helped me escape. You think they'll believe you just went along." She didn't answer, because she knew he was right. They were past the point of clean exits, past the point of clarity, past the point of innocence. The desert opened wider around them, vast and merciless. Rocks, dust, and emptiness as far as she could see. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of life. Just the endless road stretching ahead like a corridor to some unknown fate. Trevor pointed to a fork in the road. "We'll turn off here. There's a service road a few miles ahead, old mining territory, abandoned. No cameras, no people. And no help," she whispered. He didn't deny it. "Penelope," he said after a long moment, "once we stop, we need to talk, really talk, about what we do next. Because if we keep running, it'll catch up to both of us. And if we stop, then what?" He swallowed. "We'll have to decide whether we try to save each other or destroy each other." The road curved, the desert tightening around them, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt something colder than fear settle inside her. A choice was coming, a real one, and this time she wouldn't be able to outrun it. Penelope rested her forehead against the cool window, watching the desert blur into long ribbons of color as dawn finally broke. The first gold line of sunlight edged over the distant hills, steady and ancient, untouched by the mess her life had become. For a moment, it grounded her, reminded her that people had survived worse storms before her, in harsher lands with fewer options. But she couldn't pretend the weight on her chest wasn't real. "Every option is bad," she finally said, "but some are less fatal than others." Trevor kept his eyes on the empty road. "Go on. We need a place the police don't immediately think to search. Not Tucson, not Phoenix, not any highway motel where the cameras hit every face that walks in," she swallowed. "Somewhere old, quiet, a place nobody cares about anymore." Trevor nodded slowly. "There are ghost towns out here, old mining sites. Some of them still have working wells. A few even have people, the kind who prefer not to bother anyone and prefer no one bothers them." She hesitated. "Would they help us?" "They won't help," Trevor said, "but they won't ask questions." The idea terrified her, hiding in abandoned towns with strangers who didn't trust cops or newcomers. Yet she felt, deep down, that it might buy them time. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to figure out whether she was walking towards survival or a slow trap she couldn't see yet. Trevor reached for the map folded on the dashboard. "There's a place about 20 miles east. Used to be a copper mining community, all but dead now." "What about food, water, gas?" "There's a trading post a few miles from it," he said. "Run down but functioning." She considered this. The fear never left her, but another feeling crept in, one she didn't want to name. Resolve. People in the old stories, runaways, wanderers, wrongfully accused souls, always survived by choosing a direction and sticking to it. Standing still was what killed them. "Let's go," she said. Trevor shot her a quick, searching glance. "You sure?" "No," she answered honestly. "But it's the only move that doesn't end with police lights in our rearview mirror within the next hour." He let out a breath that might have been relief or worry. "All right, Penelope, east it is." They drove in silence for a long stretch of road. The sun climbed. The desert opened around them, vast and indifferent, like it had watched 1,000 desperate people pass through before them. After a while, Trevor spoke again, low and almost gentle. "You know, most people would have broken by now." "Most people never think about what they can do," she replied, "until they have to." And deep down, beneath fear, beneath uncertainty, beneath the terrible knowledge that her old life was slipping away, she felt a quiet truth rising. She was stronger than she had ever believed. She had no idea if strength would be enough. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't just surviving it. She was steering it. "Tell me about this mining town," she said. "Everything you know." And as Trevor began to speak, the truck rolled deeper into the desert, toward old ruins and older secrets, and toward a future neither of them could predict. Every moment brought them closer to a point of no return. The narrow park road twisted between boulders and patches of mesquite. The ranger's truck was long gone, but her warning lingered like a bruise in the air. Penelope kept her hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms as the truck bounced over uneven pavement. "We can't just keep running in straight lines," she said quietly. "They'll box us in. Highway patrol, county sheriffs, rangers, everyone will be looking." Trevor didn't argue. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed ahead. "I know." "Then we need a plan that isn't just more running." Trevor let out a slow breath. "You're right, but planning takes time, and time's the one thing we don't have." Penelope looked out the window. The desert stretched in every direction like an ancient witness, vast, indifferent, holding the stories of people who fled before them, people who hid before them, people who were hunted long before police radios existed. There was something timeless about the quiet that seeped into her bones. "Turn here," she said suddenly. Trevor glanced at her. "Why?" "Because they won't expect us to go deeper into the park. They'll expect us to leave, to hit the highway, to run." He hesitated only a second before taking the narrow dirt spur she pointed out. The truck jolted as tires hit gravel. Dust rose behind them in a thin, pale cloud. The spur led to a dry wash, a wide, sandy riverbed that only bore water in monsoon months. Cottonwoods lined the edge like silent guardians. Trevor slowed, scanning the area. "No campers," he said. "No hikers." "Good." He pulled the truck behind a cluster of mesquite and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was suffocating. Penelope rubbed her arms, trying to steady herself. "We need to talk about what happens next." Trevor leaned back against the steering wheel, exhaustion lining his face. "Okay, go ahead." She swallowed. "If we keep running, it gets worse for both of us. More stolen cars, more lies, maybe more violence. And eventually, they'll catch us," he finished. "Yes." The word hung between them like a verdict. "And if we surrender right now," he said, "walk into a ranger station and give up." "They're not going to believe me," she said, her throat tight. "Not after everything, not after the bus, not after the truck, not after all the cameras we've passed." Trevor didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. She wasn't an innocent bystander anymore, even if she wanted to be. Penelope looked at him, really looked, the young man who had admitted, without flinching, that he had once considered killing her. The man who might consider it again if fear or desperation pressed him hard enough. "We need a third option," she said softly. Trevor frowned. "Such as?" "A place where we can stay unseen. Not forever, just long enough to figure out how to turn this around." a way to explain what happened without getting me destroyed in the process. Trevor stared out at the desert as though it might answer him. There might be a place, he said finally, but it's risky. Everything is risky now, she said. He nodded. About 10 miles from here, there's an old service road. It leads to a fire lookout the Forest Service abandoned 5 years ago. No cameras, no visitors, no reason for anyone to go there unless they're fighting fires. Penelope's pulse quickened, and no rangers. Not unless a fire breaks out. In winter, unlikely. It wasn't safety, but it was something close, a pause in the chaos, a breath of space before the world closed in again. Let's go, she said. Trevor started the engine, and the truck rolled forward, deeper into the back country. As they merged onto the rough dirt road, Penelope felt both dread and a strange echo of resolve, the kind born from old traditions, from people who faced impossible odds and kept moving anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because stopping meant surrendering everything. And she wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. Above them, the sun climbed higher, bleaching the desert in harsh light. Ahead, the hidden road waited, and whatever came with it. Forward in a spray of gravel, the tires screaming against the pavement as Trevor slammed the accelerator to the floor. The truck fishtailed wildly, dust rising in a thick cloud behind them as they shot out of the lot. The deputy burst through the door of the store, shouting commands they couldn't hear through the roar of the engine. His hand went to his holster, but he didn't fire too many risks, too many unknowns. Instead, he grabbed the radio mic on his shoulder. "He's calling for backup," Penelope whispered, though whispering didn't matter. The truth was already bigger than her voice. Trevor swerved onto the narrow highway, the truck rattling from the sudden acceleration. "Hold on," he said, breathless, voice shaking. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Just drive," she shouted, gripping the door as the world blurred past. Behind them, a siren wailed to life. Penelope twisted in her seat just long enough to see the deputy's cruiser pull onto the road, lights flashing, dust kicking up from the rear tires. He was coming fast. Trevor's hands were white-knuckled around the wheel. "We need distance. I can lose him." "You can't outrun radios," she said. "Every unit within 30 miles knows exactly where we are now." "I know," he said, his voice breaking, "but I don't have another choice." The truck tore down the desolate stretch of road, but the deputy stayed close, 30 yards behind, then 20, then 10. The cruiser's lights splashed red and blue across the mirrors, a pulse of inevitability closing in. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, "Pull over now." Trevor shook his head violently. "If I stop, we're done, both of us." "Trevor, I'm not letting them take you for something you didn't do." "That's not your choice," she cried. He didn't answer. His jaw was clenched, his breathing shallow, his eyes locked on the horizon like it was salvation. But Penelope could see the truth sinking in. Outrunning one deputy was almost impossible. Outrunning an entire county, a fantasy. The road narrowed ahead, curving sharply around a rocky outcrop. Trevor took the turn too fast, and the truck's rear end skidded dangerously close to the edge of a shallow ravine before he corrected it. The cruiser kept coming. "They'll shoot the tires," Penelope said, panic edging into her voice. "If they disable the truck, we crash." "I know." The siren's scream grew louder. The deputy was so close now that Penelope could see his determined expression through the mirror, focused, steady, ready to end this. "Trevor, we can't outrun them," she said. We need to think. There's nothing left to think about. There is always something left, she said, her voice trembling with the kind of conviction born from desperation. Even now. Trevor slammed a fist against the wheel. You don't understand, I can't go back. They'll bury me. I'll die in prison. And if you keep running, we both die out here. The words hit him like a physical blow. For one terrible moment, the truck drifted toward the shoulder as his resolve faltered. The wheels kicked up gravel. Penelope grabbed the wheel instinctively, helping him straighten the path. Behind them, the deputy's cruiser closed the final gap. He was right behind them now. No more room. No more time. Trevor exhaled shakily. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? Penelope asked. For everything. Before she could answer, Trevor jerked the wheel sharply and veered off the road onto a barely visible dirt track that cut into the hills. The truck bucked violently over the uneven ground, throwing Penelope against her seat. The siren vanished behind them, muffled by dust and rock as the cruiser struggled to follow. Trevor kept pushing the truck deeper into the rugged terrain, dodging boulders and scrub, the landscape growing harsher, more dangerous with every passing second. Penelope braced herself, realizing the awful truth. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was trying to disappear. And whatever happened next, whether the truck flipped, whether the deputy caught up, whether the desert swallowed them whole, it would change everything. For both of them. Forever. The blast of the engine swallowed every sound around them as the deputy lifted his gun, his mouth forming commands neither of them could hear. Trevor jerked the wheel as if fighting the truck itself, and the vehicle lunged out of the parking lot like a startled animal thrown into traffic. In the mirror, Penelope caught the deputy speaking urgently into his radio, his posture stiff with alarm. He's already spreading the word, she murmured, feeling her stomach coil. They'll know everything about us before we hit the next mile marker. Trevor didn't answer. He only pushed harder on the gas. The truck rattled like it was coming apart, tires screeching on every curve, shocks groaning under the weight of speed it was never meant to carry. But in an empty desert with no cover, speed was the only shield they had left. Where do we even go now? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Trevor exhaled sharply. Anywhere that isn't here. This truck's a death sentence. We ditch it, find another ride. She scanned the horizon. Nothing but dry earth, distant hills, and lonely stretches of road. The nearest town was barely more than a handful of houses and a gas pump. Their fuel gauge hovered above half, but with the way Trevor was driving, it would drain fast. We could disappear into Phoenix, she offered. They'll choke every road into that city, he replied. Tucson. Same trap. What about east? That's what I told the deputy. They'll be waiting. The map formed a cage around them. 3 major cities forming a triangle of dead ends. Beyond that, only desert. And the desert, she knew, didn't hide people. It exposed them. Trevor, she said quietly, I think we both know how this ends if we just keep running. He glanced at her, jaw tight. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time we stop choosing the worst option. We call someone who can help. We turn ourselves in on our own terms. The idea hung in the air like a storm cloud. Trevor gripped the wheel until his knuckles blanched. You honestly believe they'll just listen? They might. Better odds than if we get dragged out of a wrecked truck with half the county behind us. He didn't argue. He didn't have to. The silence told her he knew she was right and hated it. And if we do, she added softly. What's next? More stolen cars, someone getting hurt, someone getting killed. As if the desert itself wanted to answer her, a faint humming rose from above. A dark speck moved across the sky. Growing. Approaching. Trevor's eyes widened. Is that? It's for us, she said, and she knew she was right. The helicopter was still distant, but closing in with purpose. Soon it would lock onto them, and every move they made would be broadcast to patrol cars across the region. Trevor, she said, pull over. He shook his head. No, not like this. Pull over. Penelope, I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. I'm choosing to get out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The decision had settled in her chest like a weight she no longer had the strength to carry. They'll grab you anyway, he insisted. Maybe, but at least I'll speak for myself before they decide who I am. And me. You try to vanish. You get as far as you can. Trevor swallowed, torn apart by choices he couldn't fix. You're asking me to abandon you. No, she whispered. I'm asking you to save what's left of this. The helicopter's thumping beat grew louder, vibrating through the truck. It was close enough now that she could see its shape clearly, a predator circling its prey. Trevor stopped. The truck slowed, shuddering as it eased onto the shoulder of the long, empty road. Out, she told him. He hesitated, eyes shining with a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said, voice cracking. I know, she answered, but here we are. He stepped out, lingering by the door as if hoping she would change her mind. Go, she urged. Trevor looked once more at the helicopter bearing down on them. Then he turned and sprinted toward a cluster of rocks a quarter-mile away, the desert swallowing him piece by piece. Once he vanished, she slid into the driver's seat and folded her hands in her lap. Waiting, breathing, accepting. The helicopter arrived first, circling over her like a cold, mechanical bird of prey. Its cameras locked onto her, sending her image to a dozen screens she would never see. 10 minutes later, 3 sheriff vehicles approached from different directions, lights cutting through the sunlit dust. Officers spilled out, weapons raised, voices trying to rise above the roar of the aircraft. Step out of the vehicle. Hands visible. Move slowly. Penelope opened the door, the dry wind brushing her face as she lifted her hands. And in that moment, standing alone on a forgotten stretch of desert road, she finally stopped running. She obeyed every command with careful precision, stepping from the truck with hands raised, moving exactly where they told her, and finally lying face down on the scorching asphalt as officers secured the scene. The cuffs felt impossibly heavy, cold metal biting into her wrists. The back of the patrol car reeked of disinfectant and hopelessness. Where's your partner? One officer asked, eyes sharp as they merged onto the highway. I don't know, she answered, and it was true in the only way that mattered. Ma'am, you're facing multiple felonies. Vehicle theft, fleeing authorities, conspiracy. Help us find him. Maybe we can work something out. I want a lawyer, she said firmly. The officer simply shrugged, leaving the words hanging between them. The jail was small, sterile, fluorescent lights glaring down to make everyone look pale and tired. The processing dragged on for hours. Fingerprints, photographs, forms, endless questions she refused to answer without counsel. When it was over, they shoved her into a holding cell alone. A cramped box of concrete walls, a steel bench serving as both seat and bed, a narrow slit of reinforced glass revealing the fatting sky outside. She sat, time stretching and bending around her. The sun bled from blue to purple to black. No one came. No answers. No indication whether Trevor had been caught, whether charges had been filed, whether anyone believed her story of being swept into this nightmare by accident. Silence gnawed at her, a deeper torment than any chase had ever delivered. At least on the road, she had choices. Now, all she could do was wait and pray that truth carried more weight than circumstantial evidence. Near midnight, a guard appeared at the cell door. "Hardwell, detective wants to see you." The interrogation room was harsh and unyielding. No windows, 2 blinding lights. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit sat across a metal table, poring over a thick file. "I'm Detective Morrison," he said without looking up. "Sit." Her hands folded in her lap. She waited, heart hammering. "Interesting story your partner told us," he began, voice calm but heavy. Her pulse stuttered. "You caught him about 2 hours ago, hiding in an abandoned mine shaft roughly 3 miles from where you were arrested. He's fine. Very talkative, actually. Told us all about how you helped him steal that bus, how you've been running together for the past day and a half." The words landed like stones in her chest. Every choice, every desperate step taken together, suddenly twisted into betrayal. "He's lying," she said, almost a whisper. "Is he?" Morrison leaned forward, flipping a page. "Because his story matches the evidence. Your fingerprints on the bus, your role in stealing the pickup, your cooperation in avoiding police." "I was kidnapped. I had no choice." "Coerced?" Morrison asked, lifting an eyebrow. "Because he claims you never complained, never tried to escape, never sought help when you had the chance." Each statement rang technically true and damning beyond measure. How could she explain that her compliance had been survival, not partnership? "I want a lawyer," she repeated. "Miss Hardwell, your partner is cooperating fully," Morrison said, voice matter-of-fact. "He told us about the convenience store robbery, about how you allegedly planned the escapes together, how this whole partnership started from day one." "That's not true." "Oh, because he says you met at the maintenance yard, claimed you were his girlfriend helping him steal vehicles for cash, and that your accidental passenger story is just a fabrication to cover your tracks." Her stomach dropped. The betrayal was total, crushing. Trevor had not only abandoned her, he painted her as the architect of the crime, a willing accomplice in every way. "He's lying," she said again, though her voice sounded fragile even to her own ears. Morrison leaned back, steepling his fingers, eyes tired but piercing. "Maybe, but his version aligns with the evidence. And yours," he shook his head slowly. "Honestly, it reads like someone trying to dodge responsibility." She felt the walls of the room shrink. "Hear what I think," Morrison continued. "You and your boyfriend decided to steal vehicles for quick cash. The convenience store robbery, planned or an unexpected complication. Either way, you're both in deep, and it could get much worse." "How much worse?" He didn't flinch. "Felony murder during a crime. Life without parole in Arizona." "I didn't kill anyone," she protested, panic rising like wildfire. "Under the law, being part of a criminal conspiracy that ends in murder makes you just as culpable as the one who pulls the trigger," he said evenly. Her world spun. Life without parole, for fear, for survival, for trusting someone who had betrayed her utterly. "Unless," Morrison added, leaning closer, "you want to tell the real story. You want to show us the truth. You want to explain what actually happened." The words hovered in the air, heavy with possibility and danger. She slumped onto the cold bench, the weight of handcuffs still pressing into her wrists, feeling the full, crushing reality of her isolation. Detective Morrison's words lingered in the stale air, some hint of understanding, some invitation to cooperate, but always laced with the unavoidable truth. Her fate was now tangled with choices she hadn't fully made. "I've been telling the real story," she murmured, the words barely audible. "No," Morrison said, voice sharp, deliberate. "You've been spinning a story about being an unwilling passenger, but the evidence doesn't back it up." He opened the file and spread photographs across the table. The travel plaza in stark detail, the abandoned bus, the convenience store with its shattered glass and spilled goods. "This is what a jury will see," he said, each photo a frozen moment, each angle telling a story stripped of fear or coercion. You and your partner working together, stealing, fleeing, acting as one. Her stomach tightened. Yes, she'd been with him. Yes, she'd helped drive the stolen truck. Yes, she'd run. But the panic, the terror, the helplessness, it wasn't visible in the still images. "The prosecutor will present you as a practiced criminal," Morrison continued. "Someone who understood exactly what she was doing, now playing innocent to avoid consequences." "But that's not what happened," she protested. "Prove it," he challenged. How? Her voice cracked. "Start with the money," he said. "What money?" "The cash from the convenience store. Your partner claims you helped him hide it." Her eyes widened. Trevor hadn't just betrayed her. He had spun a web of lies that implicated her in crimes she didn't even know existed. "I want to see him," she said, desperation creeping in. "See who?" "Trevor, I need to talk to him." "Not going to happen. He's given us everything we need. Your conversation won't change a thing." He gathered the photographs, closed the folder, and let the silence settle over her. "Think carefully, Miss Hartwell. Picture spending the rest of your life behind bars for something you didn't willingly do. Then consider whether protecting someone who's already thrown you under the bus is really worth it." He moved toward the door, but she called out, voice trembling. "Wait, what if I tell you everything, the truth?" "I'll listen," he replied, "and then we'll see if your version holds any weight." Left alone, she stared at the empty table, haunted by the knowledge that somewhere else in this same building, Trevor was weaving another story, one that would ensure she faced the consequences alone. Minutes later, Morrison returned, carrying a legal pad and recorder, ready to talk. "Yes," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "Good, start at the beginning, everything." She spoke, tracing each misstep, each confusion at the Phoenix terminal, the accidental bus, the spiraling series of mistakes that had turned her life upside down. She watched his face for any sign of belief, but Morrison remained a neutral observer, pen poised, eyes professional and unreadable. An hour passed before she finished. He turned off the recorder, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. "That's quite a story," he said, "and you swear it's the truth." "Maybe it is," she whispered, "but proving it. Your partner's story is simpler, cleaner, and backed by evidence. A jury will compare a convoluted tale of accidental involvement to a straight criminal narrative. That's what they'll likely believe. What about the terminal confusion, the wrong bus? We'll verify it, but even if that checks out, it doesn't explain your actions afterward. Why assist in stealing the second vehicle? Why not escape when you had the chance? I was terrified of him, of being hurt, of no one believing me. Yet here you are, asking us to believe you now, Morrison said, voice calm but piercing. The circle of fear and misjudgment she had lived through now trapped her completely. What happens next? She asked, voice low. Next, we verify what we can. Interview witnesses, check surveillance, reconstruct the timeline. Then the prosecutor decides charges. And if they don't believe you, you go to trial and hope a jury is more sympathetic than I am. Morrison stood again, pausing at the door. One more thing. If this is true, if you really were just an innocent woman caught in a nightmare, I'm sorry. The system doesn't always protect people like you. He left and she sank back onto the bench, staring at the narrow strip of night sky above the desert. Outside, the world stretched vast and indifferent, horizons she might never see again. Thoughts of her sister, of her nephew's wedding, of the quiet apartment she'd left behind, mingled with the memory of Trevor, the choice she'd made to stay, an act of misguided loyalty that had led her here. The lights from a distant town flickered against concrete and steel, a reminder of the new reality she could not escape. Somewhere in this building, Trevor likely slept soundly, secure in the fortress of lies he had built. And she, alone, betrayed and reshaped by circumstances, faced a future confined by bars and bureaucratic decisions, a future where truth might never be enough. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the feeling of innocence, but it was gone, replaced by the cold, fluorescent reality of her new life. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, hearings, prosecutors, judges, 12 strangers deciding her fate. But tonight offered only darkness, silence, and the stark certainty that sometimes truth isn't meant to save you. Sometimes it doesn't even matter.